Established in 2007, Middle East Studies at Marine Corps University brings in guest lecturers to speak about topics of importance to the United States Marine Corps and wider Department of Defense and U.S. government communities concerning the Middle East, broadly defined. In line with Middle East Studies' mission, the MES lecture series and other MES talks and panels provide up-to-date information and analysis on the broader Middle East, including South and Central Asia, North and Sub-Saharan Africa, the Eastern Mediterranean, and the Black Sea and Red Sea regions.
Good afternoon for everyone here in the United States, and good evening for our distinguished speaker, Dr. Dimitrios Triantaphyllou. He is a professor of international relations and director of the Center for International and European Studies at Kadir Has University, that is in Istanbul, Turkey. His educational background comes from our country, from the United States. He holds a BA in political science and history from University of California in Berkeley, and has an MA and PhD at international relations from Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University here on the East Coast. I'm not going to read all of his bio for you. You have it all there. I will just say a few things about the topic, which I think he is one of the better people to discuss the topic of Eastern Mediterranean. And today, I think he will more concentrate on the Greek and Cypriot positions and see how that juxtaposes with other situations in the Eastern Mediterranean. But he has been at the Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy in Athens. He has been in the EU Institute for Security Studies in Paris. He's worked a lot on the Black Sea as well, but I'll leave those because right now we are talking about Eastern Mediterranean. He has been an advisor to the Hellenic Ministry of Foreign Affairs, again in Athens. And he's also a member of Greek and Turkish Forum. He convenes many of these forums on bringing in scholars and practitioners, whether it's on Black Sea or regional issues. And I have been very privileged to be part of some of those gatherings of his. And his more recent applied and research interests include Greek-Turkish relations, Turkish foreign policy, Black Sea security and politics, and EU foreign and neighborhood politics. He is, I would believe, the only Greek who has ever obtained the rank of full professor in the Turkish Republic. Am I right on that? So he has been teaching in Turkey. So I don't think we can have somebody else with more understanding, both the academic, working with the Greek side, trying to bring in the Greeks and Cypriots and Turks together, but also being in Turkey and observing this from while he is a professor and the head of a center based in Istanbul. With that, I thank you very much. We are dear friends, and I always am inspired and learn from him. But thank you for joining us in such a late hour. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tarzi Amin, my dear friend. Thank you for the invitation. Actually, I am the first professor, full professor of international relations, a Greek professor of international relations at Turkey University. There might be others in other disciplines, and there are two or three other colleagues, Greeks now teaching international relations in Turkey. Hopefully they will join my ranks at some stage. But thank you for the nice introduction, and I value very much our cooperation and friendship and our exchanges whenever we get to meet. And thank you very much for the invitation. I'm always awed speaking to an audience such as this because it has to do with your background, your military background. I'm a social scientist, other than having done my 23 months of military service. That's really my connection to the military. And so my approach is a bit different. I'm not someone who likes to use PowerPoint. I prefer to lecture. But then this topic itself is a topic that I've been talking a lot about recently over the last few years. And as I go over my notes and try to restructure my lecture, I'm always thinking that, you have to bring in new things and new dimensions, because as I'm exploring it and trying to understand it, I am also learning new things. And so in particular, as I will be focusing, I mean, I will do sort of an overview of developments in the Eastern Mediterranean and the interplay of different stakeholders, regional and extra-regional stakeholders, and then focus and try to explain in particular the challenges for Greece and Cyprus, the Republic of Cyprus to a lesser extent. Um, but you know, as in the introduction, you said I also deal with the Black Sea issue, but one of the key questions right now when we look at this region and the Eastern Mediterranean is also try to define the region. And you know, maybe during the Cold War, one always spoke, there were some books out there and articles about, you know, a triangle. It was about Turkey, Greece, and the US. So, but it was very much limited to the Cold War context as part of a wider dividing line between East and West. But over time, this definition has been enhanced as more actors are playing a role, but also there is a linkage with other regions. There's sort of a continuum now that's more and more evident, even to the crisis between Russia and Ukraine at the current stage. And there's a continuum that seems to be developing between, say, the Black Sea region, the Aegean, the Eastern Mediterranean, the Central Mediterranean, the Middle East, the Gulf, even Asia, and even for that matter, East Africa and West Africa. And we have to sort of put everything into context in that sense. Because we are in an era of maybe alliance formations, because even the discourse, the rhetoric that's out there from political leaders, and not only a lot of analysts, is one that sort of harks back to alliances and axes and alliances against others and so on. And this discourse in this era of alliance formation or attempts at alliance formation and their projection as such by their sponsors in terms of foreign policy discourse um, imply also a sense of the militarization of foreign policy. Uh, and you know, one example, I mean, others, many Greeks might disagree with me, but one point I'd like to make. So last week, Greece received the first of its 6 Rafales um, planes that, you know, he has a deal to receive 24 of them from France and received the first 6. And those came in with much fanfare to the point that they, you know, flew over the Acropolis and live on television, on Greek television, until they arrived in Tanaga, the air base, where they were received by, you know, the Prime Minister and the Minister of Defense, and even blessed by high clergy of the Orthodox Church. But interestingly enough, I have a problem with that fanfare. But anyway, okay, because we know we were going to receive them. But the thing that struck me, and that's when I talk about sort of the militarization of foreign policy making, was that at the time that these planes were flying over, as they came from France and they flew over the Acropolis, the new foreign minister of Cyprus, Yannis Kassoulidis, was actually paying an official visit to his Greek counterpart, Nikos Dendias. And from the foreign ministry building in the center of Athens, which is very close to the Acropolis, there's a picture of them looking up in the sky and pointing to the planes and in a way welcoming them. And I just thought it was a very odd picture. And they played up on this. I thought it was very odd that foreign ministers should highlight this, highlight this dimension, which is something for the military, and maybe it for defense, and maybe it made sense for the prime minister to play his show with the minister of defense and the higher echelons of the military at the Air Force base. But was there a reason for the highest diplomats in both either Cyprus or Greece to join in from the foreign ministry premises to point to those planes? But this is just an example, but this also happens in the discourse, and I think it's something that we have to keep in mind as one has to deal with the challenges of the region. It also shows sort of the need to champion diplomacy. There's a need for that, to champion diplomacy and in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Aegean. It's a given. And how do you do this? And this again was highlighted because of developments over the last couple of weeks, where a supposed non-paper by the US State Department that was probably handed to Athens, Nicosia, and Tel Aviv either late December or early January, and some of its contents have leaked, basically says that the US is putting an end or is withdrawing its support, even though it's not directly involved, to this pipeline project, the East Med gas pipeline, which was supposed to link Israeli gas found off the shore of Israel and Cypriot gas found off the shore of Israel with a pipeline that would extend some 1,900 kilometers over land and sea, of which 1,250 kilometers would be linking Cyprus to uh, you know to Greece, and from there transported to Europe via Italy, I think. And this is a pipeline which was something that was conceived about a decade ago. It has been a tough ride, a tough sell. Many doubts about its viability, economic viability, and ultimately that's also linked to the fines, the different fields of Israel and Cyprus, and whether they're enough to actually merit this pipeline, which logic is in a way the diversification of energy supplies of Europe, which is dependent on its energy resources, and diversifying them so that to lessen even more the dependence on Russian gas. But nevertheless, so there's always something new happening, right? The non-paper, which has made a lot of noise in Athens and Cyprus, at noise in Turkey as well, the Rafales and number of other developments. So there is a suggestion in that sense that there is a need to diplomacy to sort of come in, and the need to champion this, and in particular, urging the different stakeholders, regional stakeholders, at the heart of the differences in the Eastern Mediterranean. And in particular, here we have the phenomenon of, and these are not new differences. These have been around for decades, even during the height of the Cold War. But we have NATO member states, Greece and Turkey, facing off each other, but with major differences in the region. We have EU member state Greece and Cyprus, and facing off in that sense also Turkey, which is a candidate for accession, negotiating its accession, albeit the difficulty in the accession process. If we bring in France in the equation, which has become a major partner of Greece, another NATO member state, an EU member state, at odds with Turkey, and so on and so forth. And the US there as well, as it is everywhere, trying to figure out how the two primary NATO member states in the alliance, the southern flank, work and will work together. So it's nothing new, but then again, it's something that has to be defined within today's context. And then these two primary NATO member states in the alliance's southern flank, Greece and Turkey, have been at odds with each other, divided over a growing number of issues in their respective, as I would call, Lebensraums, space, right, with repercussions regarding sovereign rights or even sovereignty in certain cases. This is also something that has been rising as well. And so while the Cold War dynamics implied the maintenance of a modicum of uneasy peace as the Soviet threat was real, this post-Cold War era, which is also going through different manifestations, has not necessarily been marked by some sort of consensus, in part due to its unstable nature and the evident shift away from a multilateral to a multipolar world. And this is sort of where we are, and so we have to figure that out. And therefore, the dynamics in the region are also, in a way, one has to examine them at different levels. There is the global level, of course. That's why the continuum that I talked about is there, and to keep this in mind. There is a regional level, which is the Mediterranean level, and not only, where you have key actors. I mentioned some of them at odds with each other. there's a European level as well, or even within the Mediterranean, where European powers such as France and Italy are at odds, maybe even Spain, if you bring that in, and then you have other big powers like Turkey and Egypt playing a role, as well as Israel. Divergences at European level as to how to deal with the situation, tied into the relationship some countries have economic and other with Turkey, and the whole argument as to whether one has to continue trying to keep Turkey in connected to the EU and the Western world, or let it shift away, but towards what, and debates about it, and under what conditions. So we have to consider all of that. And of course, these are all manifestations of this, shift, as I said, between from a multilateral to a multipolar world. And as such, the current reality shows that the region is a long way from a long-term, stable confidence and trust-building mechanisms, given the extended nature of the current crisis, among which many of the Eastern Mediterranean stakeholders are involved, whether these are regional or extra-regional. And here there's a key role, I think, for key actors, extra-regional stakeholders, even though one is the EU, which is also a regional one. I mean, Cyprus and Greece are member states. And unlike in juxtaposition to the cases, say, of Syria and Libya and other conflict zones in Europe's southern neighborhoods, such as the Sahel, for example, the role of the EU is at the core of these challenges, because the nature of Turkey's relationship with the European Union fundamentally complicates this trust building process, given the former status as a candidate state. I mean, this both binds the EU and Turkey into a more normative and comprehensive sort of relationship than with other neighboring countries, other third countries to the European Union, but it also creates frictions given Turkey's regional power status and potential, and how Turkey would want to manage this relationship, which is not necessarily for the management of the relationship to be an EU-led attempt, which is how the EU has always attempted its foreign policy, or maybe the EU is only now trying to define a foreign policy because EU foreign policy making has basically been since inception a policy based on enlargement. It has been. This is what, if you think about the history of the European Union since its founding, when it was back called in the 50s and the 60s European Economic Community, and later European Communities, and later EU, it's been about how from 6 countries they became 9 and 10 to 12 to 15 to 25 to 27 to 28 and now back to 27. It's about enlargement and managing the neighborhood, as opposed to thinking more strategically, which is something that this power shifts ongoing at European level, at regional level, at global level, have been pushing the European Union to try to define a foreign policy. And as it doesn't really have one, given its complicated nature and interaction between its different parts, member states, institutions, and so on, it also means that countries like Greece and Cyprus have to deal at different levels and in a way try to punch above their weight in order to have their cases heard, respected, and so on and so forth. And so, in order to improve this relationship between Turkey and the EU, it is important to recognize, as I said, that this multifaceted strategic realignment is underway, both within countries and between them, and everything is in flux. Also, in terms of EU-US foreign policy priorities, EU-US relations, US-Turkey relations, EU-Turkey relations, EU foreign policy, and so on and so forth. And this fluidity extends inter alia to the interactions between Russia and the West, the UK's post-Brexit relationship to the EU, and the United States, China's growing influence, the ramifications of existential threats of climate change and pandemics. And, there's a term that's also used by many, I use it periodically, liquid context, which is what's been happening in a way, which has considerable ramifications on the Aegean and the Eastern Med. I mean, the liquid world, it's a term that was used by Zygmunt Bauman. He passed away a few years ago. He talked about liquid modernity, this Polish sociologist. And he talked trying to explain modern society, but it's a term that one can apply maybe to international relations. And so we have to look at this, where in the absence of levers or checks provided by the accession process, gridlock and uncertainty on how to move forward is very much evident. But also, furthermore, today's complex complex polycentric world, compounded by inter-alliance ruptures, strategic drifts, and malign foreign influences, which is another reality that has been added on, and it's an effect in the wider region, is also further connected with the emergence of linkages that were not as striking previously. The growing, and I talked about this at the beginning, this growing arc of connectivity between the Black Sea region, the Aegean, North East, Central Mediterranean, the Gulf and beyond, West Asia, West Africa, East Africa, is evidence of this changing geopolitical context, which implies that the bilateral relationship between Greece and Turkey cannot be seen or dealt with from an isolation, within isolation, in isolation from the EU-Turkey relationship, or even the Washington-Ankara relationship. This might be easier for a country which, like Turkey, a regional power plus, a regional power that's trying to become even something more than that. It might be more difficult for a country like Greece, which is not a regional power. It's a mid-sized country within the EU, but a small country, or a country like Cyprus, which is even smaller. And therefore, the smaller a country is, it focuses in its immediate neighborhood and its immediate dealing with the threats or the threat perceptions it has to cope with. But it has to keep in mind, and this is part of the problem of Greek foreign policy making, even though there's ample evidence that Greek policymakers are aware of trying to overreach. And that's why I said punching above its weight, having a voice and influence beyond just its immediate neighborhood, and addressing what it perceives to be the Turkish threat as a factor of instability in the Eastern Mediterranean, and not only. So the thing is, how do you deal with this? How do you account? And then and the EU factor, where again a small or very small country does want the EU to be involved. If you think also about the European Union, this entity, this sui generis entity of 27 countries, most member states are small or very small countries. Actually, as I said before, Greece is a mid-sized country within the EU with a population of 10 plus million. It's in the middle somewhere. Most other countries are small. There are two or three there, Portugal, Greece, Belgium, which is about 10 million. And then, other countries are small. Why do small or very small countries join the EU? Because they feel that by belonging there, a lot of their national prerogatives can somehow be included in the wider EU debates and EU policy-making directions and so on. But as the EU is divided, or it's in the process of rethinking its policy, or late because the EU policy-making structures are slow in the making, and one can see now, the immediacy of trying to deal with the Ukraine crisis and the EU's inability to have a common position, which is natural, because that's how the EU operates. It seems to be operating on a different calendar, other than moral support for Ukraine and so on. But you see major divergences among its big powers, and therefore, understandably also, the divergences between its big powers as to how to approach Russia, especially in this case between France and Germany. It's other smaller countries on standby, as they usually coalesce around the bigger powers, which is natural. But how do you deal with this? So even in the case with Turkey, the first issue has to do with accounting with divergences between member states, and attempts to make do without a fundamental rethink of the relations between the two sides, which is where we are today. There's no policy beyond enlargement policy, and enlargement is stuck. And so what do you do? And even though there's talk and debates about, thinking of a new strategy, there's also talk, and which is let's wait and see what happens with, if there's going to be electoral change in Turkey. And if not, there's not going to be when elections do come up at the latest by the summer of 2023. Then we deal with, the continuation of the government in Turkey and try to refigure the relationship. But that's because of differences among member states and European institutions. The second reflects on a sort of a paradigmatic reconsideration of the relationship, which is predicated institutionally on the accession process, but is fundamentally frozen, if not irretrievably damaged. In fact, if Turkey's accession process were for some reason beginning to move forward, it would still need tinkering for allow for the dynamics of the current state of play in the international order, where Turkey has enhanced its role, or at least projects itself as such, and demands that it has an enhanced role. So, in other words, in the absence of levers and the leverage provided by the accession process, the relationship between Turkey and the EU is one of a level playing field, as the latter does not have to play by the rules, norms, values, and obligations encapsulated in the accession process. This was always the case, even before we got to this situation, ever since Turkey was officially, in the late 1990s, given the green light to start its accession, to be considered an accession country, and then in the early 2000s to start its accession process. Now, and it's always been a complicated relationship, but now that in the absence of these levers and in the absence of this, in the presence of this Turkish strategy to sort of reconsider its priorities, and to act more autonomously, and augment its presence, it's even more relevant how this process needs to be redefined. So for now, what has the EU done? But this is relevant, and one of the key issues, of course, pertaining to the Eastern Mediterranean is Turkey's refusal to recognize the Republic of Cyprus, which it has to if it wants to ever accede. Because it seeks, given the divided island and the context, in a way, logically, from a Turkish perspective, it seeks to whitewash part of the development since 1974, where, as the guarantor power of the Republic of Cyprus, which was founded in 1960, it had the right to intervene, but it did not have the right to stay, and it has stayed over a third, with almost direct control of a third of the island, with a large military presence, and so on. And this is a reality; it's on the ground. So how do you deal with that? And so, how does the EU try to deal with this in light of the frozen accession process, in light of the fact that two EU member states in the Eastern Mediterranean have been calling and saying sovereign rights and even sovereignty is being threatened by Turkey because, for a variety of reasons, you guys know, we're not going to get into it. We could in the Q&A. And of course, given the inability or unwillingness to have a comprehensive strategy or strategic for Turkey, the best one can do is to have successive European Council, where the leaders of either heads of state or government of EU member states meet every 6 months or every 3 months. And we've had them October 2020 after the high tensions in the Eastern Med between the Greek and the Turkish navies, December 2020, March 2021, and all through last year, where there is an attempt to rethink, to push forward for a positive agenda, to deal with Turkey, an advanced, continue a dialogue with Turkey on issues where what we would call low politics, people-to-people contacts, climate change, and other issues, trade, and so on, and monitor progress there, and the willingness to cooperate would then maybe give time for an EU strategy to develop and for Turkey and the EU to reconsider the relationship. But this EU's relationship with Turkey is inexorably linked to the debate regarding the need for strategic autonomy of Europe. And what is strategic autonomy? Having a foreign policy, which it does not really have, or what the European Council of Foreign Policy has called strategic sovereignty. Which is what Europe needs, but cannot, because because of the nature of the animal that it is. And so this is in a way where the EU stands and the limits of what it can and cannot do, other than talk about norms, about the legality of international law, and so on. But in this new geopolitical age, the US also has also been trying to define its policy and how it deals. Not that it has necessarily changed, because the security or stability, quote unquote, of the Cold War era sort of allowed. Yes, we know this was a dividing line, this part of the world. Both Greece and Turkey, in that sense, were outliers, flank states, protecting the southern flank because of their geography and their location, albeit their differences. Against the Soviet threat. Now, this has not necessarily changed from the US, but it has to be, the strategic interests have to be redefined uh, on the basis of current developments, where we have the rise of a Cold War or a Cold Peace, where instead of pivot to Asia with the emergence on both the geoeconomic and geopolitical fronts of competition with China, but also the attempt by Russia to show that it's still a great power and to be present. And this is all, and this, again, if one looks at the geography and things of the geography, this has obvious impact on Greece and Turkey. And the definition or lack of definition of US priorities, or maybe Athens and Nicosia have not necessarily understood them, is an issue. And then it's also countering the malign Russian and Chinese influence in the Black Sea region, the Balkans, the Middle East, and the Central Mediterranean. And so how does one do this? And we see this attempts. I mean, is it promotion of democracy, which is what the Biden administration had with its summit? Is this the right way forward? Is it another way forward? Is it still an America First agenda, which is a bit different? But how do you deal with this by focusing on the pivot to Asia, by making sure that Europe and European countries can sort of take care of their own interests? And in this geopolitical, okay, let me go here a bit further down in my notes. And while all of this is happening, the need of the Europeans to sort of recalibrate or calibrate their role in order to strengthen its leverage and bargaining power, um, um, and also to act in capacity in concert with its normative, its values and interests, right? The normative component of what binds the EU together. And so for the EU, it's sort of an attempt to sort of address this age of innocence, where the EU finds itself in the midst of a strategic shift towards ensuring stability and resilience, where it has to reevaluate policies, instruments, and acquire the requisite mix of sticks and carrots, where the term power and its applications plays a key role. According to Josep Borrell, who is a high representative for EU for foreign affairs and security policy, the EU foreign minister, and the vice president of the European Commission, strategic autonomy is more salient than ever because the world has changed. I mean, anyway, he is the EU foreign minister, again, in quotation marks, and therefore he takes on that role and says we have to do something. The EU has to have, now it's convincing the member states. And so some of his arguments are there because they're very much relevant to what the member state needs to do. I quote, he says, because the world has changed, it's difficult to claim to be a political union able to act as a global player and as a geopolitical commission without being autonomous, strategic autonomy. And there are three factors, according to Borrell, that make this need for EU strategic autonomy more salient than ever. The first is the shrinking of what we call the weight of Europe in the world, from a quarter of the world's wealth 3 decades ago to no more than 11% of the global GNP in 2040. One can see the trends. And this implies, again, and if I quote Borrell, if we do not act together now, we will become irrelevant, as many have argued cogently. Strategic autonomy is, in this perspective, a process of political survival. The second factor has to do with the transformation of economic interdependence from being the backbone of of multiculturalism to becoming politically very conflictual. Because this has been, if foreign policy making has been about enlargement, and countries aspire to join and eventually join when they meet conditions, and small and very small countries therefore feel more protected. Part of it has to do with the logic that, how did the French and the Germans overcome 80 years of conflict, two world wars that were actually Franco-German wars, and so on and so forth, and the Franco-Prussian War of the 1870s, where in the three wars that I mentioned, Paris was invaded by Germany, was by reformulating things, creating a paradigm shift and focusing on the economics, and also allowing for the differences, right? So economic interdependence is key to shaping the EU, but it has become conflictual. So what was traditionally called soft power is becoming an instrument of power. And this one can see in this evolving, very real competition with the Chinese and Belt Road Initiative and so on and so forth. And the third factor has to do with the systemic shift in the world's focus towards Asia, particularly US policy. So again, this is Borrell saying, this implies that the EU and its member states have to do more for their own security. And the growing number of conflicts on the EU's periphery, whether we talk about the South, North Africa, the Middle East, or we talk about the East, Black Sea region, Ukraine, and so on and so forth, Belarus and Georgia and so on, and the Caucasus, the growing number of conflicts on the EU's periphery thus increasingly have become predominantly the EU's concerns, as the United States has been trying to minimize its role. And yet, as Borrell notes, in these conflicts, such as Nagorno-Karabakh, Libya, and Syria, he says, one is witnessing the exclusion of Europe from the settlement of conflicts in favor of Russia and Turkey. And one can add to this possibly in Ukraine or Kazakhstan, which has been normalized for now, but we don't know how this will evolve. When it comes to Turkey, an EU candidate state, which increasingly does not act like one, right? Its behavior could, to a great extent, be explained by the fact that it's also affected by systemic change. I mean, if we consider this period, because we say it's a post-Cold War period, and the end of the Cold War was real systemic change, where everywhere at national capitals, everyone was reconsidering their security priorities and reconsiderations, and what it would mean. What does the end of the Cold War mean for them? European countries. It meant that there would be an eventual U.S. withdrawal of troops. That the security guarantees be maintained or not, and therefore one had to rethink and see how one could survive in this post-Cold War world. Well, 30 years, 3 decades since the end of the Cold War, we're still going through systemic change, and so Turkish behavior could be explained by systemic change and its interpretation of its impact on its national security, perennially seeing itself as an outlier, both in geographic and normative terms. Turkey is seeking, within the purview of the self-help doctrine, which all countries are guided by, to rationalize its power via the development and practice of a more autonomous action and foreign policy making. And Ankara, rightly or wrongly, is ever more convinced that the West, institution represented by NATO and the European Union and the presence of the United States, neither understands the security concerns, nor provides the requisite guarantees to protect and defend its interests. As such, with projections of demographic growth to a country of at least 100 million within the next 20 years, or growth models showing that it will eventually become a top 10 global economy, plans were for it to occur by 2023. Maybe it will not happen by 2023. Right now, it's not even a top 20 economy, but it will happen at some stage. So Turkey has sought to strengthen its claim or stake to being a significant pole in this geopolitical age. And this has been coupled with a strategic drift away from the West that could potentially lead to a strategic reorientation. We're at the drift phase. And every time a crisis occurs, such as now the need for NATO to have a common voice, is it possible or not, with regard to the Russian threat to Ukraine, Turkey becomes, its strategic significance becomes enhanced. But this drift could become at some stage more than just a drift. Um, it could lead to a strategic reorientation, and hence its impact on the normative multilateral framework that defines the West and the EU in particular, which seeks to redefine itself without losing its soul. And so this is where, consequently, both Greece and Turkey, marked by their history and geography, cannot avoid rationalizing their relationship within a wider context where actors such as the US and the EU undeniably have interests to project and defend, as well as have a role to play in moderating this complexity of the bilateral ties between Athens and Ankara, for example, in particular, while guiding the two sides towards the resolution of their key differences. So, what have been the attempts by, and interestingly enough, a number of things have been happening over the last few years. While US-Turkey relationships have been and are at the lowest point, Greece-US relations have been in the highest point in decades. And in fact, even US-Cyprus relations have been at the highest point ever. This is something to consider. There is a linkage why this might happen, but one has to keep that in mind. Now, how has Greece in particular tried to deal with this perceived threat? Greece, whether it wants to or not, has to enhance its deterrent capacity, and it's something that Greece has fallen behind on because it has had an economic crisis for over a decade, debt crisis and economic crisis, and where the GDP per person of the average Greek was cut by about 30% since a decade ago, and this has had an impact on public funding and financing. But in light of this perceived growing Turkish threat, which for Turkey is its own sort of strategic autonomy, Greece has, at some costs, there will be a price to pay for this, gone into augmenting its deterrence capacity, buying Rafale fighters, buying frigates, negotiating to get corvettes, maybe even at some stage moving on, upgrading its F-16s and so on, and even at some stage might even potentially be a buyer of the F-35 aircraft, and not, among other things. It has also tried to, at regional level, stress the trilaterals. You have the development of trilaterals: Greece, Cyprus, Israel trilateral, Greece, Cyprus, Egypt trilateral, Greece, Cyprus, Jordan, Greece, Cyprus, Lebanon. And some of these, where the Greece, Cyprus, Israel trilateral there's also +1 format where the US is part of that as well. And that has moved beyond just defense cooperation to cooperation with understanding on a variety of issues that can bind all the countries involved together. It has also created some regional fora, the East Med Gas Forum, in 2019, which I think became an international organization, regional organization in 2020, which binds together a number of the regional countries. Or the Philia Forum, which is more recent, 2021, where the foreign ministers of not only Greece, Cyprus, and Israel, but also a number of Gulf states attended the meeting in Athens. So it's trying to multiply the levers of, as I said at the beginning, trying to punch above its weight by trying to, yes, motivated by how to address what the perceived Turkish threat, but on the same hand, trying to increase its leverage. At the same time, it has signed a defense deal with France, not only for the purchase of corvettes and frigates, but also a deal which has raised a few eyebrows because there's a mutual defense clause in there, which is a very interesting clause. Some might say, and this has been the French and the Greek argument, this is an extension. It's a most trying to get the EU, because it's two EU member states after all, EU's attempt to have strategic autonomy. And actually in 2019, when the France and Germany signed the Aegean Declaration agreement, there is also a mutual defense clause in there. And so it makes sense for the Europeans to move forward. But it has raised eyebrows because it has to do with Turkey. And it has enhanced its relationship with the US, right? With the agreement to extend the mutual defense cooperation agreement with the US, with enhancing Suda Bay in Crete, the port of Alexandroupoli in northern Greece, and other facilities, and so on. It has done all this. To this in the Q&A, because I see from the organizers that we should go to the Q&A. But it has also been doing something else, which has not been much discussed in this, what I talked about at the beginning, which is this militarization of foreign policy, discourse in particular. There is a wider game there, and this is sort of linking into the EU approach of connectivity. The key word is connectivity. Trying to become much more than just a transit state in different regional or transregional initiatives. And what do I mean? In this famous US non-paper, where, as I said, the US withdrew its support for the East Med gas pipeline, the US, though, says a few other things as well. It says, first of all, that it supports the 3+1 process, Turkey, Israel, Greece, Cyprus, and Israel +1, the US, that relationship which is being enhanced, which is actually being supported by the current Israeli government, even though this was something that was done by the Netanyahu government. But it also highlights support for electricity interconnectors, as there's a transition going on to a carbon-free Europe, at least by 2050, and this is part of the climate accord. And so it stresses, for example, the very real Europe-Africa interconnector, which is the linking by cable and at the seabed between Egypt via Cyprus to Greece and then the rest of Europe, which has a capacity of 2 gigawatts capacity. And that's because Egypt itself has been taking the lead in renewables, and a part of the renewables technology has to do a lot with solar energy and so on, which there's a capacity to do this and therefore feed the rest of Europe. And also support for something that's also being discussed, which is the Europe-Asia interconnector, which is sort of the same logic. Israel, Cyprus, Greece, again, using the capacity, and then Israel itself is not that Israel necessarily has capacity for renewables or solar energy, but we just read recently, it was in November or December, where an agreement, as part of the changing environment with the Abraham Accords, an agreement was reached between Israel, say, and Jordan, whereby Israel would provide desalinated water to Jordan, which desperately needs. And even though Jordan is not a part of the Abraham Accord, but there is cooperation there, while Jordan, with investment from the United Arab Emirates, would by 2026, with a major investment, I cannot remember how many billions, would produce solar energy in the Jordanian desert, which would be sent to Israel. And all of this shows the potential of this connectivity. And imagine, this is actually happening at a time where both Jordan and Israel feel the need to do this. And no one is actually talking about, the Palestinian issue. It's been sidelined, right? So what has been happening is that there are a number of potential interconnectors where Greece, in an attempt to increase its strategic depth, has also been involved. And this doesn't get a lot of notice. There is a new sort of relationship emerging between India, West Asia, and Europe, a trade interconnector. In fact, in October 2021, the foreign ministers of the US, the Emirates, India, and Israel actually met. And this trade route, with the objective of driving China's BRI, Belt Road Initiative, to the ground, from transportation networks into Europe, and maybe sidelining or reducing the relevance of the Suez Canal, is something that's under development, whereby ships Right now, there are estimates that if a ship that loads in Mumbai in India goes all the way across through the Suez Canal to the port of Piraeus, it takes about 17 days. But if one uses this multinodal interconnector, which means ships would go from Mumbai to Dubai, then by rail across even to the Arabian Peninsula, to many cities in Saudi Arabia, and from there to Jordan, and then there will be a need for, which exists, as rail links are being connected right now, and then by rail from Jordan to Israel, it's a 300-kilometer rail link, of which 90 kilometers are already operational, and then from the port of Haifa to the port of Piraeus, and then from Piraeus on by train to the rest of Europe, the shipping time or the time for transport of goods would be reduced to 10 days from 17 days, right? And so, but interestingly enough, it enhances the position of Greece strategically, at least in terms of this connection. There's also this budding relationship of which is key between Greece and Egypt, not only because of the potential of the electricity interconnectors, but also connecting Greece or East Africa to Greece via Egypt, and actually also the Middle East via Egypt, and whereby for Greece, which stands at the threshold of strategic shift that could see the country become Europe's gateway to the emerging East Africa to Europe and Middle East to Europe commercial corridors, and so Greece right now is going through a transformation of not just being a transit state in this context, something that only Cyprus does not have the capacity to be more than a transit state, but being involved in innovation, by creating an innovation hub, by taking the lead when it comes to green energy, by trying to ensure that Greek companies start investing in a lot of these African countries, so that enhances its role. Because simultaneously with this, there's competition also on this commercial front and interconnectors, because Italy with Turkey are also working in creating links with the countries of West Africa. And this has to do with the competition between European countries in particular, France and Italy, as I said before, which is strategic, but it's also commercial. And actually right now, Egypt's role is being enhanced, supported by the EU. France is a major investor in Egypt, and potentially Greece wants to ride that wave, and also in the meantime also try to transform its economy, and thereby convincing EU member states other than France that it can be the hub for all these investments and these goods coming into Europe. So this connectivity, the potential of connecting to East Africa, connecting to Asia and West Asia with India, is something that's right now also in the making. And it's something we lose sight of. To end, I know I'm running a bit over, but I just had some proposals. So some proposals how to move forward. But maybe I can keep them for the Q&A.
Yeah. Okay. So first question from the general audience here: do you see a connection between the U.S.-Russia talks over Nord Stream 2 in Ukraine and the U.S. withdrawal of support for East Med or Eastern Mediterranean?
Yeah, East Med.
I don't necessarily. I mean, on the one hand, the logic of East Med gas pipeline made sense. As I said, it's an attempt for Europe to diversify its sources. But interestingly enough, there's a development that we don't talk much about, and the U.S. has not mentioned this in its non-paper, but the U.S. has become the largest exporter of shale gas to Europe. And actually, if one looks at trends, U.S., I have the numbers somewhere here in my many notes, has actually augmented its supplies of liquefied natural gas to Europe. And so I think this is a dynamic that even when the East Med gas forum gas pipeline was being considered, yes, the fines are not as big capacity-wise to fill the pipeline, but what we've had in the meantime over the last decade is this production of U.S. shale gas, which is being exported, and in that sense, I think the U.S. Does want to ensure that it continues to play that role, because it has enough, for example, according to numbers that I've looked at, U.S. exported to Europe last year was about 25 billion cubic meters of shale gas. And in fact, last month, 7.16 million tons were shipped to Europe in the form of 106 vessels, up 16% from a year before. And so at the time of growing energy demand and prices, the US has the capacity to fill in the demand and actually for its companies also to make money out of it. So I think this has been a new dimension also, that maybe there was no need to invest into a pipeline, which would cost somewhere between 6 and 7 billion, where even the EU, which was funding a feasibility study, has been wishy-washy about whether this is a viable pipeline or not, right? And ultimately, I think in the general context, I think the fact that the pipeline is not there could potentially act. It's not on the table anymore, even though officially it's not out there, but could act as a CBM. Because the reality is what? Part of the dynamics of competition between Greece and Turkey and Cyprus have been driven by the potential of natural resources in the East Med's deep seabed. And in fact, even Turkey has been unsuccessful in finding much stuff. I mean, in the areas where, it claims in the disputed exclusive economic zone of Cyprus, for example, and in part also of its continental shelf, the US, Turkey, has actually sent over the last few years 2 research ships, 3 drilling ships in disputed waters. At least 8 drills have been made, and nothing has been found. So by taking the potential of that out, there might be calls for an enhanced moratorium, which could jumpstart some sort of relations between Greece, Turkey, and Cyprus. It could potentially, because even by doing this, you're starting to challenge the viability of Turkey's blue homeland doctrine. The blue homeland doctrine, according to Turkish officials, exists, and not that it's going to go out of the table, it's going to exist, but it could be modified as a reaction to Greek Cypriot and Greek attempts and other regional powers' attempts to create that pipeline and to move together and even creating the East Med Gas Forum. And as a reaction to being excluded, Turkey said we'll have the Blue Homeland Doctrine, and then it went through its delimitations with the Tripoli government in Libya of its maritime zones and the myriad of problems out there. If you did this as a reaction to attempts by the others, and those attempts have sort of been nullified now because the East Med gas pipeline is not on there, well, maybe one should stop thinking of it in those sense, and maybe one can sit down at the table to try to figure out some sort of different relationship. But I also think, as I said, that U.S. shale gas has been factored in the equation, and I guess the U.S. has capacity to provide, to make up for a lot of Europe's energy needs right now.
Okay, great. Thank you. To everyone in our general audience today, thank you for joining us, and please keep following Gulak Center Middle East Studies on our various social media channels for your chance to look for the next Middle East Studies lecture coming out. Do you have a teaser you want to put out?
The teaser is that we are hoping to get a French admiral to discuss following Dr. Triantaphyllous' discussions of Greece, France, and France's more assertive role in Eastern Med and Mediterranean as a whole, and as a European power in the Mediterranean, to discuss that aspect of the French presence from more of a French Navy perspective. Stay tuned. We will let you know. Thank you.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.